Gauteng's motor vehicle head-on collision, which of course saw that group of learners in Vanderbijlpark pass away, that being one of the latest tragedies to hit hard on South Africans. So some people say, the touching stories and images from that tragedy beamed on television and radio as well are already ingrained in their minds. So, in this and similar situations, of course, there are the medical teams that would be your first responders that are involved there. But there's also another line of first responders that's in the background. And although this line of responders is, forever physically distant, it's sometimes invited into our comfortable spaces. And of course, this is not just on our television screens, in our homes, but also on our mobile devices. So these individuals, of course, would be journalists who are some of these first responders, keeping us abreast of all the important developments that often affect our lives. And of course, this will beg to ask the question, what kind of impact does this have on journalists? What about journalists, who are sometimes at the coalface of some of these disturbing occurrences? And I want to talk a bit about this, not to take away, of course, from the pain and tragedy that is faced by the families and those who bury their loved ones this weekend. There are so many facets to this particular story and many of the tragedies that are covered in South Africa by journalists. And joined now on the line to discuss this is Reggy, Moalusi, who is the Executive Director at the South African National Editors Forum and a familiar face, of course, here on SABC News and to our viewers at home, SABC News reporter Ntshingila. To both of you, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Nonhlanhla, I want to start with you. Being at the coalface of some of the tragedies that we've seen in the country over the past couple of weeks, you were in fact covering the recent floods and the aftermath of that and the trauma and devastation that is faced by these families and how they've got to pick up the pieces, but not forgetting, not to take away from that, but there's another very sensitive issue, and I want to point to this because I know personally a number of journalists actually broke down in the face of the trauma that we saw of the deaths of those 14 young learners. How does this trauma impact on journalists in the coalface of some of these tragedies?
Well, it's a very good morning to you, Griselda, and to the viewers at home. Last week when we were in Limpopo, while I was covering the flood story, I came across this woman whereby her child was swept away by water and the child is 9 months old. After that day, I was struggling to sleep. All I could hear is those hospital machines that were beeping. Before doing that mock live, I refused, and my camera colleague Herbert was like, no, Nonhlanhla, we need to tell the story. We need to tell the people who are out there who are unable to be here, just so they could know that there's one life that survived and the child is 9 months old. And I literally cried and I refused, but Herbert Memela was like, please, can be strong, let's do this. We'll deal with the aftermath once we're done. I cried, Griselda, as I walked in front of the camera, but I had to be strong. I had to tell the story because if I don't, who will? I did that mock live. After that, when I got to my room at around 10 o'clock, I cried, like literally cried, because I could just see those tiny hands, that child who was sleeping in that bed. And for a moment, I put myself in the mother's shoes and I was like, I'm also a mother. What's going to happen if I come across a very same thing? Before being a journalist, I'm a human. And so it really hit me hard. Even during the week while I was sleeping, I had a dream. I had a dream about those machines. Yeah, it was, I can't take it out of my mind. As much as we try and be strong in front of the camera, in front of the lens, but we're human after all. These kind of things really hit us. Talking about the Vanderbijl incident, I didn't even watch it. I didn't even watch it because also my child uses transport to go to school, And so that thing builds that image as to what if my child also comes across this thing. And at the end of the day, I'm a reporter. I need to go there. I need to tell the story to the whole country. We're really suffering. The aftermath is really hard for us. It hits really hard. And I remember after finding the 20-year-old boy who went missing on Tuesday, on the 13th, seeing the family standing there waiting to identify the body. You know, the mother couldn't even come at the scene because when we got to Limpopo, when we tried speaking to the mom, you could see that the mom is really sad. I didn't even know where to start, but because I had to do it, I had to gather strength and confront the mother, try and speak to the mother despite of the language barrier, but one had to do it. And unfortunately, the person was me. And yeah, sometimes I say we need to be strong so that life can carry on. We need to tell the story that other people don't know that that story exists. If we don't tell it, then who will? Even though we suffer at the end of the day, but it needs to be told, Criselda.
I'm going to ask my colleagues to bring up those visuals that are just alongside my colleague Nonhlanhla and Ntshingila there. And I mean, you can see what the devastation looks like. She speaks about covering, you know, those floods and the aftermath of that. And I want to bring in Reggy Moalusi, who's with the South African National Editors Forum. Reggy, I mean, this week was just too much. We saw quite a number of journalists. In fact, I'll tell you this now. While you might have seen one of our journalists break down on air, there were others behind the scenes that broke down and are simply struggling because issues of mental health need to be part of the key focus of assisting journalists in this country with the daily traumas that they have to deal with. Let me bring you in there. I've seen quite a number of emails that would come through to myself as well about incidents where there is mental health workshops that are being held. Talk to us about what is being done to assist some of these frontliners. We're talking about journalists here who are constantly at the coalface of devastation, tragic news. And one of the latest examples is of these 14 learners who died in Monday's horrific crash.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Criselda, and good morning to you. Good morning to the viewers of Channel 4 for SABC. Look, we, as an organization, we take heed of this, and we understand that as editors, our journalists are going through a lot. As Nonhlanhla says as well, journalists are human beings. Journalists get affected by these. I mean, look, as an organization, we dating as far back as 2020. We started talking to the South African Depression Anxiety Group, SADC, and we were really talking to SADC about issues of assistance when it comes to mental wellness, when it comes to, you know, how can we address all these tragic stories. And if you remember, Criselda, such stories are there week in, week out. We see these stories are endless. I mean, we're talking about the floods now. Not so far back, we were talking about, you know, shootings in the Cape. We were talking about the shooting in Atteridgeville in Randfontein. Journalists respond to this. Journalists cover this. And journalists as well, earlier this week, were the first ones to get to that scene where unfortunately we lost all 14 children. And as first responders, they get to see this and they get affected. And it's only fair that they do get affected. It's only fair that we recognize what they are going through, and we're not just merely saying, look, it's a story and we must get over it and get on to another story. Hence, we said to SADC, please help us. Let's get into our newsrooms. Let's formulate strategies where journalists can have a line to respond to, where we can support our editors so that they know that they are newsroom staff, they are journalists, particularly who go out to go all these stories are supported when it comes to mental wellness issues.
Yeah. I'll come back to you, Reggy, in just about a moment. Let me come back to you, Nonhlanhla. I know sometimes, you know, we're often criticized for the manner in which we cover stories. I mean, of course, as Africans and with African culture, and sensitivities versus doing your job as a reporter when it comes to covering tragedies and stories involving death. You know, in the wake of the floods that you covered, in the wake of the 14 learners, you know, who died in that tragedy, you have to do your job. You have to speak to eyewitnesses who might have seen what has happened. You have to speak to, sometimes you have to speak to some of the families who've just heard the terrible news. Oftentimes we have to manage between not zooming in too much into a tragedy that is still fresh. And as we heard at yesterday's memorial service for the 14 learners, some of these families heard about the tragedy on television because journalists are the first responders. How do you navigate between those sensitivities and still doing your job?
Firstly, I try and put the situation around myself before going to the family or even the eyewitness. I try and picture this as if it's happening to me before I become insensitive to another person. I think very hard as to how am I going to approach this person. I need to be very strategic when approaching them, making sure that I don't hurt their feelings, but at the same time, I also get their story. You know, like I said, we are journalists and also we are human beings. I can't just get there and be like, yeah, how do you feel about this? Firstly, I need to show sympathy, you know, put myself around their shoes firstly. And I think that's one thing that I've also learned from you, whereby you've been covering such stories. First thing that you do, you start by humbling yourself and apologize, just to show that you sympathize with them, even though at the same time you need to tell the story to the world. And so those are the things that I also learned from my colleagues, that before telling a story, put the story into your shoes and also sympathize with the person, whether you are the mother, Griselda, or not. But always, I think it's important to tell yourself that what's going to happen if this is me, before being insensitive to another person. And so I think we learn along the way that this is how we need to handle stories. And so it's so important for us as junior reporters, more especially, to learn from people who've been in this industry for far too long as to how do they approach their stories. What do I do at the scene when I get there? Do I just rush off, or I need to sit and gather strength before going to those people? And so it's really hard because at some point I also cry before doing the story. I cry a lot. And I remember there was this one time I was doing this other story and at Nonhlanhla with Classes Khosana, my colleague, and I cried during the interview. And we had to pull back. Class was like, Nonhlanhla, please gather your strength. We need to do this. We need to tell the story. I really tried, but you know, these things, they come back as time goes by. And you start asking yourself, am I human enough? What's really happening? But we are human. And also we are journalists. We need to tell the story, Griselda.
Very difficult to hear there, Nonhlanhla. You know, just seeing you also, you know, getting emotional once again really tells us a story of how difficult it is. We know exactly what you're talking about. I mean, Reggy, have we become desensitized as journalists? You know, how do we strike that balance? And perhaps, you know, additional workshops on how do we strike that balance between ensuring exactly what Nonhlanhla is saying. We tell the story, but of course, you know, understand the pain of these families. Understand, you know, that some of these families, yesterday at the memorial service of the 14 learners, listening to some of the families talking about, hearing about the death of, and seeing pictures, and this was not from journalists, pictures of their loved ones on TikTok, and hearing about the news on television, on radio first. And unfortunately, the journalists are part of the first responders, so you are going to get there first, likely before some of the family members hear about what has happened. All right, we do seem to have a problem with our connection there to Reggy Moalusi, but a very, very important conversation that we are having here. And perhaps let me just come back to my colleague, Nonhlanhla Ntshingila, while we try to re-establish that connection with Reggy Moalusi from Sanef. And, Nonhlanhla, there is, of course, the public perception of how we approach or cover these tragic incidents, with some people seeing journalists as insensitive or far removed from the pain and trauma or experiences by the victims of some of these tragedies that we cover. You spoke a bit about that and how you try to navigate all of that. But just from your perspective, let me hear from you. What do you think needs to be done? What do you feel is not being done enough to help you, to help other journalists like myself and the rest of our colleagues across the media spectrum to ensure that we get the kind of assistance that we need to be able to cope with some of these tragedies?
I think firstly, Criselda, before we go to a story, or maybe during a normal day, we could have this kind of conversations that, okay, look guys, as reporters, one day you will come across such a thing, and I think we should educate each other as to, okay, this is how you need to approach the story. Don't be insensitive, but rather also show emotions, and also after covering such stories, I might be strong in front of the TV, but trust me, inside we are breaking down, Criselda. We are struggling to deal with these things. After covering those stories, maybe if we could receive, counseling or debriefing about these kind of stories as to, Nonhlanhla, how did you deal with that? We saw that it was really hard. How did you navigate around the situation? Just to have those debriefing sessions after covering tragic stories, I think it would also help us journalists.
Nonhlanhla, thank you very much indeed. And we are with you as your colleagues, of course, as you cover these, very difficult stories. And unfortunately, we lost our line to Reggy Moalusi, who's with the South African National Editors Forum, who's, of course, also stressing the importance of ensuring that journalists do get the kind of assistance as some of the frontliners, first responders, to these tragedies that take place. And I keep emphasizing that some of the family members of the 14 learners who died in Monday's horrific crash spoke about hearing about their loved one's death on television, not purposefully done by journalists, but because they have to report on something so tragic. Some of them had not yet received the news. So very, very difficult terrain to navigate for journalists.